In the daily political brawling over asylum seekers, there's one key issue both major parties are happy to ignore. That's the millions of dollars in compensation paid to detainees over claims the government has breached its duty of care in detention centres. And experts warn of huge costs beyond compensation, costs that are never discussed because they're all being settled out of court. National Affairs correspondent Heather Ewart reports.
They're often in remote and isolated places, closed off to the public eye, yet at the centre of political debate. Australian detention centres, on government estimates, cost around $160 million a year to run. But there's a hidden cost to taxpayers seldom talked about. In the past decade, the government has forked out more than $16 million in compensation to asylum seekers and detainees, and the number is growing.
Essentially, they revolve around claims that people have suffered as a result of their period of time in detention. And they might have suffered quite serious mental disorder.
What I do know is every time there's a compensation payout, it is because of a serious breach of duty by public officials who aren't answerable for it.
Clearly, any compensation payout that's made as a result of an immigration detention matter is regrettable. It may well go to the lawfulness or otherwise of the detention of that detainee and or to the duty of care that we are required to show and to exhibit while we have people in our care.
We're probably continuing to create potential cases for the future, which the taxpayers of the future will then be expected to cover.
A ruling in the federal court in 2005 found the government owed a duty of care to detainees, and in scores of compensation claims since, the government has chosen to settle out of court.
One could say that there is no great desire on the part of government to have the conditions, of settlement publicised, but more importantly, the conditions and nature of the claims themselves. So I think there's a huge sensitivity at the moment about the detention system.
You're giving money to people from societies for whom $1 is a lot of money and it's nothing here. So they're claims that are not that difficult to settle, and the government, by having settlements that are confidential, mean they're avoiding creating precedents, but more importantly they're avoiding exposure of the system in the court process, where I think they would have a lot to fear.
We would much rather than see claims resolved privately through mediation. Mediated settlement is certainly preferred to lengthy court matters that may end up costing a lot of money in terms of legal representation.
The taxpayers, if they're not alerted to what's going on, are not really in a position to make an informed judgment about what the costs of a system of mandatory detention might be. So I think it is important that these sorts of issues be canvassed in some detail.
Because of confidentiality clauses, there's not a lot of detail available. What is known is the government paid out about $8 million to 55 detainees and asylum seekers in the past 2 years. And in the 9 years before that, there were 54 compensation cases, including that of Cornelia Rao. It was this case where Australian resident Cornelia Rao was awarded $2.3 million for wrongful detention that had the government most worried. It prompted a flurry of offers to 247 people, also considered to have been wrongfully detained. They were active grace payments that did not go to court and did not involve the government admitting liability.
The offer letters that I saw were relatively low, and most of the claimants then agreed to the offers, as they were quite surprised they came out of the blue.
But it's the ongoing welfare cost to the community beyond compensation payouts that could prove to be the greatest expense of all in the long run. As detention centres become more overcrowded, stays are longer, and there are reportedly a growing number of self-harm and suicide attempts, when detainees are let into the community, they're not always in good shape.
I'm in fact still seeing people who I first met in detention over 10 years ago, some of whom still have psychiatric conditions that are impacting on their capacity to function in a very real sense.
Professor Louise Newman chairs an independent advisory panel to the government on mental health issues and well-being in detention centres. She doesn't like what she sees and hears as people emerge from detention.
People who are literally unable to work because of ongoing psychiatric difficulties. These are people who require housing and support, sometimes need support with activities of daily living, shopping, organising. These are people who are socially very isolated. They're more likely to develop drug and alcohol problems, to deal with their particular issues.
So we're actually creating the very illnesses in our detention centres that we are going to have to now subsidise as a society for the rest of these people's lives. It's a crazy situation, and no one really analyses the cost to society.
Some of these cases, I think it's fair to say, are probably going to need indefinite psychological support. And that means we have a huge cost in terms of the direct costs of providing treatment with medical specialists, but also the associated care that they might need. These are people who are now welfare dependent, who are, in a sense, disabled, and are reliant on the state for support.
So the state does carry the cost for this?
Yes, and it's a significant cost.
Would you care to put figures on it at the moment?
Look, I think it's difficult to estimate, and every case is different, but we're looking at psychiatric treatment and we're looking at welfare dependency. We're clearly looking in the order of 60,000, 80,000 per head per annum, and that's an absolute minimum.
The government knows this but doesn't specifically address the issue.
Whether, in fact, long-term immigration detention leads to greater costs overall is really a matter for each and every case that is lodged against the Commonwealth. It is certainly our aim and our objective not to have claims for compensation lodged. We want to ensure that immigration detainees are able to come out of immigration detention as healthy and as positive in their outlook as possible.
But the Department of Immigration does face more compensation claims and even this possibility.
I think it'll eventually bounce up into a class action. It's bound to happen, and the government won't be able to keep the lid on it for very long unless the government changes its ways.
Well, the law of averages would say that, regrettably and unfortunately, with more people in detention, the risk is always there that there will be an increase in a series of incidents and consequences arising from immigration detention.
As to suggestions that reopening the Nauru processing centre offshore might be the answer.
There are certainly people who are survivors of Nauru who are still being treated psychiatrically, and I think that's very sobering.
Did some of these people who are on Nauru get compensation as well?
Yes.
Would there be many of them that did?
I'm not sure of the number. There would be several.
The compensation claims and payouts are spread across all centres, but it's those in remote communities like Christmas Island that are expected to produce the most claims in the future. Lawyers say many are already in the pipeline.